Welcome to my PhD Defense Practice Podcast. This episode is designed for one purpose: to help me explain and defend my doctoral research with clarity, confidence, and intellectual honesty. My research is not simply about whether students have internet access. It is about the way different resources interact and shape students' opportunities to participate in virtual English language education. It is also about justice: who has access, whose experiences are recognized, and whose voices are represented when educational programs are designed and implemented. Before I begin, I will take a slow breath. I do not need to speak quickly to sound knowledgeable. I need to make my reasoning visible. A strong defense is not a performance of perfect memory. It is a scholarly conversation in which I explain my decisions, recognize the limits of my study, and show how the parts of the research fit together. Today, I will practice 7 central areas: the study in 1 minute, the problem and its significance, the conceptual framework, the multiple case study design, participants and data sources, analysis, ethics and reflexivity, and challenging questions from a doctoral committee. As I listen, I will answer aloud whenever I hear a question. Then I will compare my answer with the model response. I do not need to reproduce the model exactly. I need to understand its logic and gradually make the language my own. Let us begin with the most important skill in any defense: explaining the whole study simply. Here is my research in one clear statement. My study explores how physical, human, digital, and social resources interplay to foster or hinder educational equity and justice in virtual English language education at 3 regional campuses of a public university in Colombia. The 3 campuses are Bajo Cauca, Magdalena Medio, and Uraba. Although they belong to the same university and implement the same institutional English program, they are located in different territorial, infrastructural, and sociocultural contexts. These differences make it possible to examine a shared phenomenon while preserving the particularity of each case. The study uses a qualitative multiple case study design informed primarily by stakes approach. I will work with 15 students, 5 at each campus, who are enrolled in levels 4 and 5 of the virtual English modality. I will use an initial questionnaire, semi-structured in-depth interviews, institutional documents, and elements of the virtual learning environment. The analysis will begin within each individual case. I will first develop an in-depth interpretation of each campus through inductive thematic analysis. I will then compare the cases to identify convergences, divergences, and recurring configurations. Finally, I will interpret the cross-case patterns through Warschauer's understanding of physical, human, digital, and social resources and Fraser's dimensions of redistribution, recognition, and representation. The study seeks to contribute empirical knowledge grounded in students' voices and lived experiences. It may also inform pedagogical and institutional efforts to create more equitable and just virtual English learning experiences at regional campuses. Now I will try it in my own words. Now answer this question: what is your study about? Here is a concise model answer. My study examines educational equity and justice in virtual English language education at 3 regional campuses of a Colombian public university. More specifically, it explores how physical, human, digital, and social resources interact to enable or constrain students' participation and learning. Using a qualitative multiple case study, I will examine each campus in depth and then compare patterns across the 3 contexts. The purpose is not to rank the campuses or statistically generalize the findings, but to understand how the same institutional program is experienced under different territorial and resource conditions. Notice the structure of that answer. First, I name the phenomenon. Second, I identify the resources. Third, I state the design. Finally, I clarify the purpose and the limits. Here are some useful sentence frames. The central concern of my study is. More specifically, I examine. The study is designed to understand, rather than to. The contribution lies in. The problem begins with an important tension. Virtual education can expand access, especially for students who live far from a main university campus. However, access to a virtual course does not automatically produce equitable participation. Students may enter the same virtual program under very different conditions. One student may have a reliable computer, stable internet, a quiet place to study, confidence using digital tools, relevant course materials, and strong family or institutional support. Another student may depend on a mobile phone, experience power outages, share a device, have limited digital literacy, struggle with English language instructions, and live far from both classmates and university services. Therefore, the central issue is not simply access to a platform. The issue is the configuration and interaction of resources that make meaningful participation possible or difficult. My professional experience as a virtual English tutor helped me recognize this problem. I observed apparent disparities between students in Medellin and students at regional campuses. Regional students often reported unstable connectivity, limited access to devices, difficulties navigating the virtual learning environment, and a need for additional guidance with common digital practices. Some also felt that tasks reflected urban experiences in Medellin more clearly than their own territorial and cultural realities. Others described limited family, peer, or institutional support. These observations are not treated as findings. They are the situated experiences that motivated the research problem. The study is necessary precisely because my impressions must be examined systematically and critically through students' accounts, institutional materials, and contextual evidence. This distinction is important in a defense. I can say this. My professional experience sensitized me to the problem. I should not say this. My professional experience already proves the conclusions. Now answer this question. What is the research gap? Here is a model answer. Research has examined digital inequality, virtual education, and English language education in rural or regional contexts. However, limited attention has been given to virtual English language education within regional public higher education in Colombia. In particular, we still need a contextualized understanding of how physical, human, digital, and social resources work together, rather than in isolation, to shape educational equity and justice. My study addresses this gap by examining students' experiences across 3 regional campuses that share one institutional program but operate within distinct territorial conditions. The phrase "work together" rather than in isolation is central. My study is not 4 separate inventories. It is an investigation of interplay. For example, having a device is a physical resource, but the educational value of that device depends on other resources: the student's digital skills, the accessibility and relevance of the learning materials, reliable support, and institutional arrangements. A material resource can be present but still be inadequate, inaccessible, or difficult to use. Now answer this question. Why does this study matter? Here is a model answer. This study matters because virtual education is often presented as a solution to geographic exclusion, but access alone does not guarantee equitable participation. By centering students' lived experiences, the study can show how structural, pedagogical, linguistic, cultural, and social conditions intersect in a virtual English program. Its contribution is both empirical and practical. It can extend knowledge about equity in virtual language education and generate context-sensitive considerations for pedagogy, institutional support, and policy. I use the word considerations rather than promising universal solutions because the study is qualitative and contextually bounded. Here are 3 useful distinctions. Equity is not the same as equality. Equality may involve providing the same resource to everyone. Equity requires attention to different conditions, barriers, and needs. Access is not the same as participation. A student can be formally enrolled and technically connected, yet still have limited opportunities to engage meaningfully. Difference is not automatically disadvantage. The study will examine when and how particular resource configurations become enabling or constraining within specific contexts. My conceptual framework brings 2 bodies of thought into dialogue. The first is Warschauer's resource-based understanding of digital inclusion. It helps me examine physical, human, digital, and social resources. Physical resources include devices, connectivity, electricity, and appropriate spaces for study. These are necessary material conditions, but they are not sufficient by themselves. Human resources concern the knowledge and capacities that support participation. In my study, these include digital skills, English language readiness, and the ability to navigate academic and virtual learning practices. Digital resources include the content and communicative resources available through technology. In this research, I pay attention to the relevance, accessibility, language, organization, and cultural appropriateness of materials and elements in the virtual learning environment. Social resources include relationships and structures that support participation. They may involve family, peers, teachers, tutors, institutional services, and broader support networks. The second framework is Fraser's multidimensional account of justice. Her dimensions of redistribution, recognition, and representation allow me to move from describing resources to critically interpreting how institutional and educational arrangements may produce or challenge injustice. Redistribution directs attention to material and economic conditions. In my study, it can illuminate the unequal availability or adequacy of devices, connectivity, infrastructure, and institutional support. Recognition directs attention to cultural status and the ways people, identities, and experiences are valued or marginalized. In virtual English education, this may involve whether regional realities, cultural identities, linguistic experiences, and territorial knowledge are meaningfully reflected in course content and educational interaction. Representation concerns voice and participation in the processes that shape educational experience. It allows me to ask whether students can express their needs, whether their perspectives are heard, and whether they have meaningful opportunities to influence or respond to the arrangements affecting them. These frameworks are related, but they are not interchangeable. Warschauer helps me identify and understand the configuration of resources associated with meaningful participation. Fraser helps me interpret the justice implications of those configurations. In simple terms, Warschauer helps me ask what resources are present, absent, accessible, or inadequate, and how do they interact. Fraser helps me ask, what do these arrangements mean for redistribution, recognition, and representation? Now answer this question. Why do you need both Warschauer and Fraser? Here is a model answer. I need both because they perform different analytical functions. Warschauer provides a relational understanding of digital inclusion through physical, human, digital, and social resources. This helps me examine the conditions that shape students' participation in virtual learning. Fraser provides a critical theory of justice through redistribution, recognition, and representation. Her framework helps me interpret why particular resource arrangements matter as questions of justice. I am not collapsing the two models into a single list of categories. Instead, I use them sequentially and dialogically. The resource framework supports analysis of conditions and interactions, while Fraser deepens the critical interpretation of their justice implications. That last sentence is worth practicing again. The resource framework supports analysis of conditions and interactions, while Fraser deepens the critical interpretation of their justice implications. Now answer this question. Are your theoretical categories predetermined? Here is a model answer. Not at the beginning of the thematic analysis. I will start inductively within each case, allowing patterns of meaning to emerge from questionnaires, interviews, documents, and the virtual learning environment. I do not want the 4 resource types or Fraser's 3 dimensions to silence unexpected experiences. After developing case-based themes and comparing patterns across cases, I will bring Warschauer and Fraser into the interpretation. Therefore, the analysis moves from inductive thematic construction toward a more theoretically informed and critical interpretation. This answer protects an essential principle of the design. Theory guides the study, but it does not mechanically determine every code in advance. Now answer this question. What do you mean by educational justice? Here is a model answer. In this study, educational justice extends beyond formal access or equal treatment. It concerns whether students have adequate material support, whether their identities and territorial experiences are recognized, and whether they can participate meaningfully and have their voices considered in the educational arrangements that affect them. Fraser's framework helps me analyze these material, cultural, and political dimensions together. My study adopts a qualitative multiple case study design with a critical orientation. The design is based primarily on Stake's 2006 approach to multiple case study research. The shared phenomenon across the cases is the quinton. In my study, The quintin is educational equity and justice in the virtual English modality of the institutional English program across regional campuses. The cases are Bajo Cauca, Magdalena Medio, and Uraba. Each case is a bounded institutional context in which the same program is implemented. The boundaries are institutional, territorial, social, and temporal. Each campus has its own infrastructural conditions, histories, support structures, and sociocultural realities. Stakes approach is appropriate because I want both depth and comparison. I need to understand each case in its particularity before examining what can be learned about the quintin across cases. I will not merge all participant accounts into one undifferentiated dataset from the beginning. I will first analyze each campus independently. This protects contextual integrity. Only after the single case analyses will I compare patterns across the campuses. Now answer this question. Why did you select a multiple case study rather than phenomenology, ethnography, or a survey? Here is a model answer. A multiple case study is appropriate because my research question concerns a contemporary phenomenon embedded in three bounded institutional and territorial contexts. I am interested not only in a common lived experience, as a phenomenological study might emphasize, but also in how the phenomenon is configured within each campus and across the cases. I am not conducting prolonged cultural immersion of the kind generally associated with ethnography. A survey could describe the distribution of certain conditions across a larger population, but it would not provide the depth, contextual interpretation, and attention to students' meanings required by my question. The multiple case study allows me to preserve the uniqueness of each campus while investigating a shared phenomenon across them. Now answer this question. What exactly is the case, and what is the quintin? Here is a model answer. Each regional campus is a case because it constitutes a bounded context in which the virtual modality of the same institutional English program is experienced and implemented. The quintin is the larger shared phenomenon that the cases help illuminate: educational equity and justice in virtual English language education across regional campuses. I study each campus for its intrinsic contextual value, but the cross-case purpose is to understand the quintin more deeply. One wording adjustment is important here. I should avoid casually saying that the cases have intrinsic value if that might be confused with Stake's formal category of an intrinsic case study. A safer answer is, each case has contextual particularity, while all three cases are selected for their potential to illuminate the shared phenomenon. Now answer this question. Why these three campuses? Here is a model answer. Bajo Cauca, Magdalena Medio, and Uraba were purposefully selected because each offers a contextually rich and distinct configuration of territorial history, infrastructure, social conditions, and institutional access. At the same time, all three operate within the same university and the same institutional English program. This combination creates a strong basis for examining variation within a shared institutional framework. The cases are not intended to represent all regional campuses statistically. They are selected for their potential to illuminate the quintin under different contextual conditions. Now answer this question. How are the cases bounded? Here is a model answer. The cases are bounded institutionally by the regional campus and the institutional English program, geographically and territorially by the three selected subregions, socially by the participating students and relevant support structures, and temporally by the period of study within the virtual modality. I will make these boundaries explicit so that the unit of analysis does not become too broad or ambiguous. Now answer this question. Can you generalize from only three cases? Here is a model answer. The goal is not statistical generalization. The value of the study lies in contextual depth, particularization, and theoretically informed interpretation. By providing rich descriptions of each case and a transparent cross-case analysis, the study may offer insights that readers can consider in relation to other contexts. However, I will not claim that the three campuses represent every regional campus or every virtual language program. My claims will remain proportionate to the evidence and the boundaries of the cases. The phrase claims proportionate to the evidence is useful in a defense. It communicates rigor and restraint. The study will include 15 students, 5 from Bajo Cauca, 5 from Magdalena Medio, and 5 from Uraba. They will be enrolled in levels 4 and 5 of the virtual English modality. This is a purposive selection. The participants are not chosen to achieve statistical representativeness. They are selected because their sustained experience in the program can help illuminate the phenomenon. Students in levels 4 and 5 have had sufficient exposure to reflect on resources, support, course materials, participation, and changes over time. Variation across social, economic, cultural, territorial, and educational backgrounds is important because it can broaden the range of perspectives within and across cases. However, the study does not treat demographic diversity as a checklist. The key criterion is the participants' potential to contribute relevant, experience-based knowledge about the virtual program. Now answer this question. Why are 15 participants enough? Here is a model answer. The adequacy of 15 participants must be judged in relation to the qualitative case study design, not by statistical sampling standards. The study seeks depth within 3 bounded cases, with 5 information-rich participants per campus and multiple sources of evidence. Each participant will take part in an interview lasting approximately 60 to 70 minutes, and their accounts will be interpreted alongside questionnaires, institutional documents, and elements of the virtual learning environment. I will evaluate adequacy through the depth, richness, and relevance of the evidence while remaining transparent about the limits of the participant group. I should be careful with the word saturation. Different qualitative traditions use it differently, and Stake's case study approach does not require me to defend the design through a mechanical saturation formula. It is more consistent to speak about information richness, depth, contextual understanding, and the capacity of the cases and participants to illuminate the quinton. The study uses several sources. First, an initial questionnaire will provide preliminary, contextual information. It will explore technological access, connectivity, digital literacy practices, learning conditions at home, institutional and peer support, and perceptions of participation. The questionnaire is an entry point, not the main instrument for making population-level claims. Second, I will conduct 15 semi-structured, in-depth interviews. Their flexible structure will allow me to address common topics across participants while giving students space to express meanings, experiences, and unexpected concerns in their own terms. Third, I will analyze institutional documents. These include the master document of the Institutional English Program, course syllabi, foreign language policy documents, and planning or regionalization documents concerning territorial inclusion and equitable access. Fourth, I will examine elements of the virtual learning environment, including instructional texts, tasks, interface language, visual representations, icons, characters, forums, and platform-based interactions and materials. These elements may reveal how access, participation, representation, and educational experience are configured within the program. Now answer this question. Why do you need both interviews and document analysis? Here is a model answer. The sources answer related but different questions. Interviews provide access to students' meanings and lived experiences. Institutional documents provide evidence about formal intentions, policies, and program design. Elements of the virtual environment show how some of those intentions are materially and semiotically expressed in tasks, interface language, representations, and interactions. Bringing these sources together allows me to examine convergence, complementarity, and tension between institutional discourse, educational design, and students' experiences. That answer is stronger than saying only, I use several sources to validate the data. Triangulation is not simply a search for identical answers. Sources can confirm one another, add different dimensions, or reveal meaningful contradictions. Now answer this question. What is the role of the questionnaire? Here is a model answer. The questionnaire is an initial contextual and exploratory instrument. It provides a preliminary map of students' resource conditions and experiences and helps identify issues that require deeper exploration in the interviews. It is not designed to produce statistical generalizations. Its function is to inform the qualitative inquiry and broaden my understanding of the range of experiences present across the 3 campuses. My analysis has 3 main movements. First, I will conduct a single case analysis for each campus. I will repeatedly read the interviews, questionnaires, institutional documents, and relevant virtual environment materials. I will code meaningful segments inductively, compare evidence across sources, group codes into categories, and refine categories into themes. The purpose is to preserve the contextual integrity of each case. Second, I will conduct a cross-case comparison. I will examine convergences, divergences, and recurring configurations across Bajo Cauca, Magdalena Medio, and Uraba. I will compare how resource conditions and educational experiences are configured, while avoiding the erasure of important territorial differences. Third, I will move toward critical theoretical interpretation. Cross-case patterns will be considered in relation to Warschauer's resource framework. I will then use Fraser's dimensions of redistribution, recognition, and representation to interpret the justice implications of those patterns. This is an iterative process, not a rigid linear staircase. I may return to the data when theoretical interpretation raises new questions. Nevertheless, the order matters because I do not want the theoretical framework to predetermine all participants' meanings. Now answer this question. How will you ensure rigor or trustworthiness? Here is a model answer. I will support trustworthiness through several connected practices. First, I will triangulate interviews, questionnaires, documents, and virtual environment materials, examining both convergence and contradiction. Second, I will maintain an explicit audit trail of coding decisions, theme development, and changes in interpretation. Third, I will provide rich contextual descriptions so readers can understand how interpretations are connected to each case. Fourth, I will use reflexive notes to examine how my insider position, assumptions, and emotional responses may shape data production and analysis. I will also seek critical dialogue with my supervisor or research peers and, where appropriate and ethically feasible, invite participants to clarify important interpretations. These strategies do not eliminate subjectivity. They make the interpretive process more transparent, disciplined, and accountable. This answer includes methodological commitments that should also be made explicit in the final written proposal. I must promise only the procedures I am genuinely prepared to implement. Now answer this question. How will you protect participants? Here is a model answer. Participants will receive clear information about the purpose, procedures, possible uses of the data, confidentiality measures, and their right to withdraw, without penalty. Participation will be voluntary, and interviews will be recorded only with consent. Names will be replaced with pseudonyms, and identifying details will be removed or carefully masked. Data will be stored securely and accessed only for authorized research purposes. Because the campuses and participant group are relatively small, I will also consider deductive disclosure. Even without names, combinations of details may identify a person. I will therefore make careful decisions about quotations and contextual description. Now answer this question. You work in the program. How will you manage your insider position and possible bias? Here is a model answer. I do not claim to be neutral or detached from the field. My insider experience gives me contextual knowledge and may help build trust, but it also creates risks. I may take familiar practices for granted, interpret accounts through previous experiences, or be perceived as institutionally powerful. I will address these risks through reflexive journaling, transparent documentation of analytic decisions, attention to disconfirming or uncomfortable evidence, and critical dialogue with supervisors or peers. I will also clearly distinguish my institutional role from my researcher role and emphasize that participation or withdrawal will have no academic consequences. Reflexivity is not a statement that bias has disappeared. It is an ongoing practice of examining how my position shapes the research. An important sentence for my defense is this. My proximity to the field is both a resource and an ethical responsibility. Now I will practice shorter responses to difficult questions. I will answer first, then listen to the model. Question 1. Is your study about equity, justice, or digital inclusion? Are there too many concepts? Here is a model response. The central phenomenon is educational equity and justice in virtual English language education. Digital inclusion is not a separate competing topic. It provides a resource-based way to examine the conditions of participation. Warschauer helps operationalize attention to interacting resources, while Fraser provides the critical justice lens. I will maintain this conceptual hierarchy consistently so that the study does not become fragmented. Question 2. Are physical, human, digital, and social resources really separate? Here is a model response. They are analytically distinguishable, but empirically interdependent. Their value lies precisely in examining their interplay. For example, connectivity may exist, but without appropriate digital skills, accessible materials, or institutional support, it may not enable meaningful participation. I will use the categories as sensitizing concepts, not as sealed containers. Question 3. How will you avoid imposing a deficit view on regional students? Here is a model response. I will avoid treating regional location or limited resources as individual deficiencies. The critical orientation directs attention to structural and institutional arrangements, while the qualitative design allows students to describe not only barriers but also capacities, strategies, networks, and forms of agency. I will examine how disadvantage is produced relationally and contextually, rather than assuming that students or regions are deficient. Question 4. What if the 3 campuses are more similar than different? Here is a model response. Similarity would also be an important finding. The design is not based on a promise that dramatic differences must appear. Recurring patterns across distinct contexts may reveal institutional or structural dynamics associated with the shared program. At the same time, I will examine whether apparently similar patterns have different meanings or consequences in each case. Question 5. What if the documents contradict the students' accounts? Here is a model response. Contradiction is analytically valuable. Institutional documents may express formal intentions, while students describe implementation and lived experience. I would not automatically treat one source as the truth and the other as an error. I would examine what the tension reveals about policy, practice, access, recognition, or participation. Question 6. What is the original contribution of your study? Here is a model response. The study contributes a contextually grounded account of educational equity and justice in virtual English language education within regional Colombian public higher education, an area that remains underexplored. Conceptually, it brings a relational resource framework into dialogue with a multidimensional theory of justice. Methodologically, the multiple case design makes it possible to preserve territorial particularity while examining patterns within a shared institutional program. Empirically, the study centers the voices and experiences of students whose regional realities may be less visible in institutional discourse. I will end with a final statement that I can adapt for my candidacy defense. This study begins from a simple but consequential idea. Offering the same virtual program does not mean that all students can participate under equitable conditions. Students encounter virtual English education through different combinations of infrastructure, knowledge, materials, language readiness, relationships, and institutional support. By examining 3 regional campuses as distinct but connected cases, I seek to understand how these resources interact and what their configurations mean for redistribution, recognition, and representation. I do not aim to speak for every regional student or to produce a universal model. I aim to develop a rigorous, contextualized, and ethically responsible interpretation grounded in students' voices and in the institutional environments they navigate. The ultimate value of the research lies in making visible the conditions that foster or hinder meaningful participation, so that virtual English language education can be understood not only as a matter of access, but also as a matter of educational equity and justice. I know my study. I can explain my choices. I can acknowledge limitations without weakening my research. And I can defend the coherence between my problem, my question, my framework, my methodology, and my ethical commitments.